Practitioner from Helena. She's also an adjunct here at the law school, teaches immigration law, is going to give us a presentation about the impact of the Patriot Act on immigration issues, especially the Hmong. I would remind you that we're all being recorded, not only through the law school, but MCAT is also recording this part of the proceedings, and so if you don't want to be videographed, you don't want to have your recording made of what you have to say, then this is a good time not to ask questions. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Debbie Smith. Thank you.
I'm Deb Smith. I was asked to talk today by Jim Taylor. About a month ago, he called and asked if I would participate in this symposium that the law school was having on civil rights and the war on terror, and he was interested in having a perspective brought in about immigration. I am an immigration attorney. I'm in private practice. I teach here at the law school. My practice is primarily, but not exclusively, removal defense. I was delighted to receive the invitation and to accept it, and I'm honored to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers that are doing such important work for us, both for the government and for the military and in private practice. You know, I want to note that, well, the primary emphasis of today's and last night's event has been on the Guantanamo detainees and on the enemy combatants that are associated with Al-Qaeda and other groups, that there are a lot of collateral targets in the war on terror. And those are some of the people, at least, that I deal with. After 9/11, there were various things that came together that created the Patriot Act. And there were a lot of different political and social agendas going on, only one of them being but the predominant one being going after the people, the criminals that had attacked us in this horrible way. But in addition, what you had going on was a long-standing interest by law enforcement to try to get greater powers to snoop on people in the United States. You had people that were interested in reforming immigration law, you know, primarily in cracking down on the undocumented population in the United States for various reasons, including some of the fallout. Many of you look old enough to remember the amnesty from 1986 that was still playing out in the mid-1990s when the World Trade Centers were bombed the first time, and when also the Oklahoma City attacks occurred. You know, after Oklahoma City, about I think a year to the day after the Oklahoma City bombings, EDPA was signed. The what you got, American Effective, I can't remember the A. I think it's Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act. It did many things, but one of the things it did in large part was amend the Immigration Act to make it easier for aliens that had, to kick them out of the U.S. if they had committed certain criminal offenses. You know, so acts of terrorism perpetrated by U.S. citizens wound up largely with the remedy being focused on aliens that had absolutely nothing to do with the Oklahoma City attacks. And later, so after EDPA, about 6 months after that, the Immigration Act was reformed again to make it even easier than under EDPA to kick people out of the U.S. and to prohibit them from getting in. And really, what happened with the Patriot Act, and then a subsequent law I'll talk about a little bit called Real ID, it just tinkered on the margins of the immigration law, which is what I deal with. and primarily what I'll be talking about today with respect to refugees. Jim asked me if I would consider talking about a topic that I actually had to do a fair amount of research in, but that affects the local community in a more significant way. The Patriot Act included provisions that really made things, and I'll talk about these, this is what I'm going to focus on in my debate, that really made things tough for legitimate refugees abroad fleeing persecution and for people that had made it into the United States that were fleeing persecution and torture, made it harder for them to get protection under the Refugee Act. If you can, whatever. Let's see if I can get this going. All right. So I want to talk about the Hmong population. The Hmong, people here are familiar, the Hmong are an ethnic group that originally were from China. And in the 18th century, I believe they were getting harassed by whoever the Chinese dynasty was at the time, and they migrated down into Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the Hmong were principal fighters along with the United States in the Vietnam War, and many Hmong were resettled as refugees in the United States. So we're going to shift gears from what we've been talking about and focus now on my world of immigration, asylum, and refugee protection a bit. And I just want to tell you all who are refugees. Refugee is a term of art both under international law and under federal law. In 1980, the U.S. implemented its international agreement under the refugee, the Treaty on the Protection of Refugees. I forget, it was entered into after the conclusion of World War II. We implemented it in 1980. You'll see some statistics since the Office of Refugee Resettlement started keeping them in 1983. But under international law and our law, a refugee is a person who's unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of her country, of nationality, because she has a fear of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of a protected ground, race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. By far, the United States swamps every other country still after 9/11 in terms of its receipt of refugees into the United States, refugees for permanent resettlement. So I should explain that most refugee resettlement occurs from abroad. People leave their home countries because of political unrest, civil war, environmental disaster. They go other places. UNHCR steps in. Other country, the countries of first asylum, they're called, step in. And then the authorities divvy up the refugee population and they send them out to the four corners of the world. I think internationally about 90 to 100,000 refugees are placed annually. This is a historical figure. At least, well, you know, it's varied because after the Vietnam War there were spikes, but in recent memory, before 9/11, there were maybe 90 to 100,000 refugees being placed, with the U.S. accepting about 70 to 80,000 of them. And then after 9/11, our refugee admissions plummeted to about 20 to 25,000, and maybe even in fiscal year 2002, it might have been lower than that because it was very difficult to get into the United States if you hadn't been here before. And even if you had been living in a refugee camp in Africa or in Thailand and you were, you know, an ethnic Karen, fleeing persecution in Burma, I mean, just everyone was kept out. So we're now, I think, receiving something on the order of 50 to 60,000 refugees per year. The next highest country is Canada, just by way of comparison, and they receive something like 4,000 or 5,000 a year. So when our refugee admissions go down, the world notices. Let's see, let's go back to refugee numbers. 1983 is when we started keeping track of refugees through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Nearly 2 million refugees have been permanently resettled in the United States. Since 1983, 33% of them are from East Asia. That would include Laos. And if you go back to 75, when the United States pulled out of the Vietnam War, more than half of the refugees that have come to the United States have been from East Asia. The vast majority of them are Vietnamese, that's no surprise. And then 18%, this again since 83, 18% are Laotian, 11% are Cambodian. The top 5 countries that make up more than 3/4 of all refugee arrivals are the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Cuba, the former Yugoslavia, and Laos. And the Hmong that we're getting in the US are from Laos. There are ethnic Hmong in other nations, but the ones that I'm focusing on in my talk today are the Laotian Hmong. The Laotian Hmong, I want to talk a little bit more about what the Laotian Hmong did. The Laotian, for those of you that are Vietnam War either veterans or history buffs, know that in the early 1960s, before there was a formal war with Vietnam, the CIA recruited the Hmong in what was called the Secret War, and it funded Hmong soldiers to disrupt North Vietnamese activities, primarily along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so how the North Vietnamese were getting supplies and people into South Vietnam. But in a bigger picture, at least within Laos, the Hmong were engaged in a struggle with the Pathet, what was called the Pathet Lao, the Communist Party that was trying to take over. Laos had been a French colony. I forget when the French made it a colony. But the French pulled out, I think, in 1954. Scott Crichton's telling me yes, so we'll go with that, 1954. And then there was a constitutional monarchy imposed, and the Hmong, that left the Hmong alone. But the Pathet Lao wanted to take, there was a lot of communist unrest, so the Hmong were involved in fighting the Pathet Lao, and the CIA used them to help it fight the North Vietnamese. The CIA paid for about, in the early 1970s, had about, apparently, 40,000 soldiers from Laos in this secret army, and they were predominantly Hmong. And then in 1975, we pulled out of Vietnam, we won the war, and we left the Hmong. And the Pathet Lao came to power, the constitutional monarchy was displaced, and Hmong started fleeing Laos in huge numbers. And they went primarily to Thailand. Thailand is a country of first asylum for many, many, many nations. Gets more than its fair share of temporary refugees for resettlement. It's very difficult on that nation, which itself is a developing nation. But they, about 250,000 Hmong left Vietnam in the immediate years following the end of the war, so-called into our end of the war, our version of the end of the war, and they went to Thailand. By differing accounts, there were about 15 to 30,000 Hmong that either didn't want to leave Laos or they couldn't leave Laos, and they remained to stay to fight the Pathet Lao. They didn't go to the refugee camps in Thailand. I'll talk a bit more about them in a minute. But of the Hmong that made it to Thailand, and some went to Hong Kong, there were refugee camps there, about half of those Laotians, and they weren't not all Laotians that went to the refugee camp were Hmong. But more than half of them, I believe I read, were. And the United States has accepted, according to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, about 120,000 Laotian refugees. And I believe that's the Hmong number, because I think 250,000 was the total number that we've accepted. And most of these people came by 1995. There are, because of continuing atrocities in, to put it mildly, against Hmong that remain in Laos, there are Hmong still fleeing Laos, going to Thailand, and a few years ago we agreed to accept about 15,000 refugees that were Hmong that were living in one of these informal refugee camps. Montana has, it's the 22nd highest state in terms of its Hmong population. There aren't that many Hmong people here. The 243 from Laos are Hmong people. The Laotians that got resettled by the ORR into Montana were Hmong. So we've got a pretty small population here, small but noticeable. Let's see. I think I went through this. Primary states of resettlement are California, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and this is where some of this controversy that Jim informed me about when he asked me to speak about this had read about Hmong people having trouble under the Patriot Act. Let me see, I'm getting... Okay, Laotian Hmong in East Asia. The Hmong are the third largest ethnic group in Laos. There's about 450,000 of them in Laos. They're clan-centered. They live in remote villages in northern and central part of Laos, but they've integrated through all levels. And the reason I'm giving you this history is because of these Hmong that are still hiding in the jungle. What I did not expect to find when I started researching this was that there are refugees in the truest sense of the word that are unable to escape from their hiding places, that are being pursued constantly by the military forces of Vietnam and Laos. They're shot at, they have gas dropped on them. The Hmong marry and have children early. When you look at the refugee numbers of Hmong that come to the United States, and it breaks it out by population, compared to other populations of refugees coming to the United States, the Hmong population is young. There's a higher percentage, something like 40% of the refugees coming in are minor-age children. And there are children, there are second-generation descendants of these secret war fighters. And because Laos is a relatively closed nation, they do not accept people either from the Red Cross or UNHCR observers or Amnesty International to come in and observe. There's no way to get an accurate count of how many of these people are hiding in the jungle. But interestingly, family members from here in the United States have been able, under very difficult circumstances, to deliver solar panels to some of these people and cell phones, and they get communications. And I wasn't technologically advanced enough to figure out how to put some film clips of some film that had been smuggled out of Laos. There's a relatively new documentary called Hunted Like Animals by a woman that put together a film of the Hmong both in prison camps in Thailand. I mean, these people are considered illegal immigrants in Thailand, the new Hmong that are coming to Thailand, and they're put in jail, which I should note is not unusual. We put families in jail, including children. The prisons in Thailand are probably more squalid than ours, but nevertheless, and if you take out squalid, we've got immigrant families in jail. That at least one district court in Texas has granted an injunction in a lawsuit just recently filed by ACLU for violations of human rights conditions for the detention of immigrant families in Texas. So, you know, we're on the same par as Thailand there. But in any event, I did not expect to find that. And so I became more interested in how the Patriot Act is, in fact, affecting the Hmong. If any of you are interested in more information, just Google the Hmong. I mean, it is easy to pull up graphic images of you know, the worst sort of stuff that you really don't want to see, I guess. But you can read about it also. It's really just horrible. The Hmong in Thailand, so these are people that are fleeing now in the last few years. About 7,000 of them. There's a brand new Amnesty International report on the Hmong living in the jungles in Laos and on their detention conditions in Thailand. So 7,000 of them are living in Thailand. There are additional numbers of Hmong in Thai prisons. These people, these 7,000 have not been interviewed by UNHCR or anyone for processing of their refugee claims, but it seems clear that many of them are in fact refugees under the definition that I showed you. So on top of all this mess and background, we have the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act amended the Immigration Act in narrow but significant ways. It added new grounds of inadmissibility and deportability from the United States for terrorist activity or for giving money or material support. We see that word again, material support to terrorist organizations. There is a waiver for some of these inadmissibility grounds. I should note that the deportability grounds are tied to the inadmissibility grounds. So if you're in the U.S. and you are found to be inadmissible under this terrorist activity ground, then you can be deported from the U.S. On that ground. There's a waiver that can be granted to the inadmissibility grounds in the sole unreviewable discretion by either the Secretary of State or the Department of State. They have to consult with each other, plus the Attorney General. The Patriot Act also added some new grounds of mandatory detention for people suspected of terrorism, and there is a presumption of deportability, and basically the way that works, all the government has to do in a removal proceeding is say this is a person of interest, and all of a sudden you're under many of the same, I think, kind of rules that the people at Guantanamo are under. There's secret evidence, there's non-disclosure statements the attorney has to sign to see the evidence, your phone calls, your meetings with your clients are recorded. There's all kinds of different rules that apply when you've got people that are detained under these mandatory detention provisions. Let's see what I wanted to talk about. Okay, so the Patriot Act. So I want to talk about the inadmissibility to the U.S. under the Patriot Act, because this is where the real meat of these Patriot Act and Real ID provisions is located. The Patriot Act, as it was codified into the Immigration Act, amended a long-time section of immigration law that made people inadmissible on national security grounds. It's how communists were kept out. The Nixon administration was a huge proponent of ideological exclusion from the U.S. on the basis of your ideology or speech. So there had been, in the immigration law for a long time, national security grounds of exclusion. Well, the Patriot Act took one little inadmissibility ground that had previously been about a paragraph and made it pages and pages and pages. So you are inadmissible to the U.S. if you have engaged in, and I'm just putting some of the grounds here. If you've engaged in terrorist activity, if you're a member of a terrorist organization, if you endorse or espouse terrorist activity, if you've received military-type training from any terrorist organization. For those of you that really want to read all the grounds, I'm giving you the site. So then the question becomes okay, well, what's terrorist activity and what's a terrorist organization? Terrorist activity is any unlawful activity that involves hijacking, and again, the laundry list is long, and I'm just hitting some of the provisions. Hijacking or sabotage of a conveyance, assassination, use of biological or chemical agents, use of nuclear weapons, for example, solicitation of funds or things of value for terrorist activity or terrorist organization. And here's the thing that really applies to asylum, potential asylum applicants and refugees. Committing an act affording material support to a terrorist organization or for a terrorist activity, including offering a safe house, transportation, communications, funds, false documentation, weapons, or training in how to use weapons. So people that would offer a bowl of soup or a glass of water to a human in need are lumped in the same category of people that assassinate other people or that hijack airplanes and fly them into tall buildings. This caused these provisions of the Patriot Act just caused immediate alarm in the refugee community because, you know, just to use the Hmong as an example, the Hmong well, let me first talk about the terrorist organization. So that's what terrorist activity is. So, okay, what's a terrorist organization? And again, this is just, actually, it's a summarized version of the three main categories of groups that are terrorist organizations. A group that's been designated a terrorist organization by the Secretary of State, and actually you can go online and find the list, and there's 40-some organizations now that have been designated terrorist organizations. It's a group that otherwise has been designated a terrorist organization just by the Secretary of State publishing that group's name in the Federal Register. And then my favorite, the worst, which was added by Real ID, is a terrorist organization is a group of two or more individuals, whether organized or not, which engages in or has a subgroup which engages in terrorist activity, as it is defined previously in the statute. So, and that was Real ID. So, what's the problem? Well, as of about a month ago, now these are cases, I want to note that there's a difference between asylum and refugee cases. Asylum under immigration law. It's the same definition of refugee. The difference is where you are physically located when you're applying for protection under refugee treaties. If you're applying for asylum, you've somehow made it into the United States and you're filing your applications here. These numbers are about asylum applicants. Refugee processing occurs abroad, and then those people have their paperwork processed abroad, usually from within a third country. But in some countries, I think Vietnam and the former Soviet Union are the two only nations that do in-country processing of refugees. And it's an unusual thing to happen because it's the country acknowledging that it is persecuting or acquiescing in the persecution or acknowledging it can't do anything about the persecution of its own nationals and citizens. So usually that doesn't happen, but with former Soviets and Vietnamese it does. But these are asylum cases. So there are 621 affirmative asylum cases on indefinite hold due to the bar. Only 10 to 20 will benefit from the recent waivers of the material support bar that have been granted. Remember I said that the Secretary of State and Secretary of Homeland Security can waive the application of the material support bar in their sole unreviewable discretion. They've done that. The Secretary of State has waived the bar for two groups of refugees from Burma that are in Thai refugee camps. The Secretary Michael Chertoff of Homeland Security has waived the bar for 8 refugee groups. So in terms that, and that would apply to these asylum applications. So of the 621, 10 to 20 will benefit from these waivers, so not very many. There are 955 relative petitions on hold. What that means, the relative petitions are there are refugees and asylees in the U.S. and they want to bring their family, their wives and their minor-aged husbands, and their minor-aged children to the U.S. to be with them. So the way that the bar might apply abroad, well, it's the same way. It's like, well, are any of these people, by virtue, because family relationships, under these broad definitions, a family relationship, if you knew or should have known that your family member was engaged in terrorist activity, then you too are a terrorist. So almost 1,000 family petitions, almost 1,500 adjustment of status applications, and by refugees, and almost 4,000 adjustment of status applications by asylees. So I'm looking at 4,000, 15, more than 5,000 adjustment of status applications. That's a green card application. That's your permanent residence. So if you enter the U.S. as a refugee, you've got this 1-year temporary status, same with asylee. And then after that year, you can apply for your green card. And one of the it can be a big problem if you don't have your papers. It's a problem to work. It's a problem to maybe get your kid in school. It's one of the reasons, I know some of you know, I've been working really hard in the Montana legislature to prohibit state laws that would require production of various papers before you can get a job or do all these different things. Well, it is hard to get your papers, and Department of Homeland Security is not always very efficient about getting them. These are the 5 nations that are whose nationals are most affected by the material support bar in the USCIS pipeline. So that USCIS is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. It's the benefits arm in which the asylum office is located. So these are people filing their forms in the U.S. So it's Colombia, and this is in the top 5 order. Top 5 countries: Colombia, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. The reason that you wouldn't see Burma or Laos, Iraq is unique. There's no refugee processing yet. It's like Vietnam was during the Vietnam War. We're not getting those refugees yet. We will, but they're not affected yet. But the refugees that are abroad, no one knows. That's the short answer. No one knows how many of these people that are living abroad are being affected by the material support bar, because basically what has happened is, at least as far as the U.S. is concerned, the existence of the material support bar, according to the NGO community, has shut down refugee admissions of the following groups: Colombians, Vietnamese, Montagnards. The Montagnards are also an ethnic clan that fought with the U.S. in the Vietnam War. The Hmong, Cubans, oddly, and Liberians. And then I had talked about the exemptions from the material support bar already. All right, so what should be done about this situation? What I just went over was how the war on terror, it has a lot of different targets. And I don't know that refugees were a target of the Patriot Act designers. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those people, at least, legislators, are very vocal immigration restrictionists. So, they want to shut down legal immigration to the U.S., family, refugee, they want to shut it all down. So I don't think that these are necessarily unintended consequences of the Patriot Act. I think probably for the vast majority of Congress, my sense is that it probably is. I think that most, especially when you see the conditions in the camps, and and what people are fleeing. I just, doing the background research on the Hmong, because I didn't know. I thought, well, what is the big deal? Is it green cards getting held up? As it turns out, it is. But in addition, 30 years after we ended the war, there are small groups of people still fighting that war. They're using, it's just amazing, they're using leftover ammunition left by the CIA. They count their bullets. I mean, they're no longer able to wage war in any meaningful way against the communist government. But, you got to think, why don't you guys just give up? I mean, it's been 30 years, but the problem is some of them have tried. And hundreds of people have come out of the jungle. And the men, but sometimes the women and children, are taken to what are called re-education camps, which are prisons. I mean, there are horrible, one of the cruelest things that's being done to the Hmong is that their children are being targeted for murder and rapes, in an attempt to, what Amnesty International has done in its new report said, this is genocide. And there are just some very graphic, awful pictures. So I think that probably most legislators didn't intend that. No one would intend, not to imply that anyone intends that kind of torture to happen to people, but I do think that there's a significant chunk of people that would restrict immigration to the U.S. notwithstanding refugee processing. They say we do more than our fair share. Well, I found a list of a 10-step program that was, they didn't call it that, I called it that, to do what was called Restore the U.S. Moral Authority following 9/11, Guantanamo Bay, all this stuff. It was signed by 22 organizations, including a lot of the usual suspects you would suspect, ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, but other interesting groups as well. A group called Concerned Foreign Service Officers, Physicians for Human Rights, other people. Number 1 was Restore Habeas Corpus. Number 2 was Stop Renditions to Torture. We haven't talked all that much about it in this conference, but the U.S. is whisking people away from this country and from other nations and sending them to secret prisons for torture. We need to abolish the secret prisons. We need to hold the abusers accountable. One of the things we were chatting about, Greg, while you were speaking, was just that, today, currently, there are criminal trials in Germany and Italy against in Italy, it's 2 CIA agents. In Germany, I don't know, Tom knows more. It was Rumsfeld's being sued and some other people are being sued. We need to hold fair trials, and we need to prohibit abusive interrogations. We need to close Guantanamo Bay, to pick up on Jim Taylor's theme. We need to respect the laws of war. We need to protect victims of persecution from being defined as terrorists, like people like the Hmong. And we need to end indefinite detention without charge. Indefinite detention is something I really didn't talk about. That happens in the immigration context too, and the federal government goes to the mat on it. Anyway, so that's the end of my remarks. I thank the organizers for putting this together and thank Jim for inviting me. I'm always happy to make Montana more aware of the immigrant population here and how these laws affect, not just people that are being sent off to Guantanamo, but how they are affecting our neighbors and family members of our neighbors. So thank you.
Greg, do you want to make a comment?
There's not too much I can say on this issue because, frankly, I don't have personal familiarity with it. I am told by people in the administration who are responsible for this set of issues that we do support a legislative amendment to broaden the waiver authority to make folks like the Hmong eligible for waivers from the kind of situation that has been described.
Debbie, I had a question. So the Hmong, is there specific activity of the Hmong that's caused them to be labeled as a terrorist organization, or is it just certain groups in the Hmong?
Well, yeah, and that was my question. You know, when you first asked me to look into this, I'm like, well, this is crazy. You can't designate a whole ethnic group as a terrorist organization. That's like what we did with the Japanese in World War II. So you're Japanese, you're dangerous. But what's going on with the Hmong is that at least some of them are engaged in a rebellion against their government. I mean, there is a narrow segment of them that in the true sense of the word would be engaged in terrorist activity under true sense of the word as we define it. You know, the United States isn't currently supporting, it gets very complicated. You know, we were opposed to the Pathet Lao regime, but that was 30 years ago. And we're interested now, and you know, Laos wants to get on the WTO fast track. The U.S. is very interested and has started to repatriate Laotian and Cambodian and Vietnamese national after deportation proceedings. So, you know, the U.S. is establishing in fits and starts normal ties with Laos. And as far as they're concerned, this ragtag group of miserable individuals, I can't tell you the stuff, how bad it was that I was looking at. They are armed rebels. They're engaged in warlike activities against this regime. And when they come out of the jungle, at least some of them are being tortured, and some are being killed. So it's not, I don't know. And in terms to answer your question, like, is it all the Hmong, or is it, you know, there is a group. The general of this secret army, Vang Pao, is in the United States. He was one of the people that got resettled here in the late 1970s. And he does had a group, the United Lao National Front or something like that, and he has communications. Now, they're not listed as a terrorist organization, and I couldn't find them in one of these other Federal Register lists either. But there is a group, that group, you know, Vang Pao is still opposed to the Pathet Lao, you know, and his relatives are being annihilated by the military forces. It's a very, very bad situation for these people. They have no medical care. They have no school. Many of them have, you know, they've been horribly mutilated by gas, and there's photographs of. I mean, there's documentation that this is occurring. So, you know, and when NGOs have asked USCIS about, well, how are you designating these groups? Because it's not just the Hmong; it's Colombians, it's, you know, it's Nepalese people that, you know. I mean, there's this. I don't know there's all this unrest in Nepal right now. Others may be more familiar with it, but you know, the communist insurgents, and the U.S. doesn't particularly like the guy. Remember, he killed the king or something. I mean, there's all this stuff. So many people are being affected, and when the NGOs go to USCIS, Secretary of State, say, okay, how are you applying this? You don't get any answer. You know, our lawyers are meeting, and this is now, what, 5 years after the material support provisions have been in the law. And Real ID, you know, just it actually expanded some of these provisions, but it's unclear how it's being applied.
But are these things actually influencing the Hmong living in the U.S.?
Oh yeah, all those numbers that I showed you know, I don't know how many Hmong applications are in those backlogs, But in Wisconsin and Minnesota and California, there have been newspaper reports of people in those communities that can't work because CIS isn't issuing them green cards. I mean, they are in the most serious category of inadmissible people, terrorists. So if you are possibly a terrorist, you're not going to get your temporary work authorization, you're not going to get to bring your family with you, and it has a real practical impact on these people's lives.
Scott?
Debbie, what sort of changes went on in the immigration bureaucracy after 9/11?
Well, huge. You know, before the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, there is no more Immigration and Naturalization Service, an agency that had existed for decades. It wasn't a very functional agency. You know, it was, in large part, you know, you can't, cry crocodile tears over the loss of INS, but what we got was even more of a mess. INS was disbanded and it was broken up into 3 different groups within Department of Homeland Security that now fight with each other. USCIS does immigration benefits. That's where the asylum applicants, family, employment. You want to come to the U.S. legally, you go through USCIS. Then there's ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They are in charge of doing interior enforcement of the immigration laws. And then there's Customs and Border Patrol that does, Customs came from Department of Treasury, and Border Patrol was Border Patrol. It is in charge of border enforcement, but some interior enforcement as well. So CBP and ICE have overlapping enforcement jurisdiction. And instead of an agency where they have a common mission and the 3 different parts were just a little bit disjointed, now it's just, dealing with the immigration bureaucracy it's like, I don't know what it's like to deal with Guantanamo cases, but it's that same kind of nonsense that you go through.
Other questions? John?
Debbie, am I right in just sort of perceiving that we're also in sort of a shift from one model to another? Once upon a time, there was really no sort of national interest or social interest in a person. An immigrant might come to this country and could be on a track to be a naturalized citizen, or an immigrant could come to this country and be a permanent resident alien. Mm-hmm. And we really didn't care either way, and
right.
Maybe their kids would be U.S. citizens, and we'd work it out through the generations. Mm-hmm. But the things have changed a bit now, that if a person does not wish to be on the track to be a naturalized citizen, that we have, now you have to register more often. You can't just have a permanent green card. You have to periodically, are we creating barriers against people being here and not being on the citizen track?
Well, we're creating barriers in that it's easier to deport people before they can meet the statutory requirements to naturalize. You have to have lived in the U.S. for a certain number of years. You have to know civics. You have to pass an English exam. There are more grounds now than there used to be that make people ineligible to naturalize. But if anything, what these laws beginning in 1996 have done, as they've amended the immigration law, has been to encourage more people to become citizens. Because if you're not a citizen, you can be deported. And you can be deported notwithstanding a fear of persecution in your home country. So we are removing from the United States Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian, Hmong refugees back to, let's just use Laos. We're deporting Laotian Hmong to Laos, where we know that at least other Laotian Hmong are being killed and tortured. Now, the U.S. is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture and Other Inhuman and Degrading Forms of Punishment. I'm not exactly sure of the phrase, but it's the phrase that you use. And for the most part, irrespective of Guantanamo, because I think Guantanamo is, and the secret prisons and all that is really unique, but my observation is for the most part, the U.S. observes those obligations. And you saw that. There was a little bit of talk last night about the ethnic Uyghurs that were in Guantanamo. The U.S. did not want these people. They were a big diplomatic problem for the U.S. I mean, they wanted them out of Guantanamo, but the fear was that these people would be tortured if they were sent back to China. But because they were, I don't know all the details of their case, but I'm guessing they were these designated terrorists. They were inadmissible under 212A3. We didn't want them here, and we sent them to Albania, which is just beautiful. But you know, but that's an example of how at least we didn't send them back to a place. Now who knows what Albania is going to do with them? That doesn't sound like a very good guarantee. You know, the U.S. is supposed to send people to a country that it is assured won't render the individual for torture. Either torture the person itself or send we don't want them to go back to China via Albania, so that shouldn't have occurred. I don't know whether it did or not, but the cat, if you're in, do what I do, that's why the cat works. It works pretty well. So for these Laotians that can claim that it's more likely than not they will be tortured, that's what you have to do, or killed if they're returned to their home country. We can keep them here, but it is very, very difficult to prove that it's more likely than not that you will be tortured. Yeah.
Scott?
One other question, doesn't the Real ID require for asylum seekers to have a note from their persecutors saying that they are, like the Soviet Union and Vietnam do?
Yeah, what Real ID did, and I didn't talk about this, but it modified the standards for granting asylum to make it so that basically it was, Congress is kind of at war with the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit hears more, and DOJ is also, I see Greg kind of snickering, and in the Office of Immigration Litigation, I don't know, that the people that I deal with, there's just kind of a permanent battle between oil and Congress and the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit hears more, and Montana's in the Ninth Circuit, for those of you that don't know, more immigration cases just by far than any other circuit, and has developed, in most cases, it's got an unfair rap as the most liberal circuit, but in some ways it is, and in one of those ways was showing what the motivation of the persecutor was in order to get asylum. And what Real ID was ratchet up the showing that an asylum applicant had to make in order to demonstrate the persecution was occurring on account of a protected ground. And if I'm remembering right, and I haven't looked at this in a while, you've now got to show that it's a central reason for the persecution. So, for example, domestic violence, the Board of Immigration Appeals and OIL's position in those cases largely is that that's not motivated on account of protected ground. It's really bad. We're not saying this person didn't suffer horrible abuse, but it's just not recognizable under U.S. asylum laws. And, the Ninth Circuit had, set up different, and not just the Ninth Circuit, but primarily it set up a lesser standard. You can just show that, membership, and there's a lot of litigation on what's a social group for asylum purposes, and that made Congress uncomfortable. So they ratcheted up the standard for what the asylum applicant has to show to get protection.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. How many Hmong are left, or does anyone?
What was the number I had up there? A lot. I think it was 450,000 in Laos. They are the third largest ethnic group.
Are there any economic sanctions in place against Laotian?
You know, not that I'm aware of, and I don't think so. Really, these abuses, these human rights abuses, are just getting documented. The Amnesty International report was, well, the embargo date was something like March 26th of this year. The Hunted Like Animals DVD was out in December of last year. There had been some journalists. I found a really good Time magazine cover story from 2003 where a couple of journalists had gotten in. So it got international attention, these jungle people, before it started getting, really it doesn't have much US attention yet. But I think with especially the Amnesty International report and this new, it's not just a DVD, it's a documentary. I mean, if we lived in Seattle, or probably not Seattle, maybe San Francisco or Minneapolis or Madison, where there are very large Hmong populations, you know, you could see it at the theater.
Other questions? Thank you, Debbie.